The galaxy had a pecking order. Everyone knew it, everyone respected it, and everyone had the good sense to stay in their assigned place. Well, almost everyone. At the top of the cosmic food chain lounged the Zanari Dominion, a species of crystalline beings who had mastered dimensional engineering roughly around the time Earth's first fish decided legs might be a fun evolutionary experiment. The Zanari considered themselves the intellectual superiors of the galaxy, which was fair, considering they used black holes as waste disposal units and had solved the problem of entropy twice. Not far behind were the Vexar Imperium, whose biological supercomputers could process the entirety of most species' combined knowledge in what they condescendingly referred to as a quantum sneeze. They had evolved from apex predators on their homeworld and never quite abandoned the habit of looking at other species as potentially delicious philosophical experiments. Rounding out the top tier were the ancient collectives Hive M, so old they remembered the galaxy's awkward teenage years when it was still figuring out its spiral arm placement. They communicated exclusively in mathematics, so complex it gave lesser species migraines just by proximity. And then there were humans. "Fascinating specimens," remarked High Counselor Zixer of the Zanari, observing the first human delegation to the Galactic Concord. "So fleshy, one wonders how they've survived this long without proper exoskeletons." The humans had stumbled onto the galactic stage with all the grace of a newborn giraffe on an ice rink. Their first interstellar message, a garbled transmission about peace and friendship, had been initially classified as background radiation until someone noticed it contained too many references to something called pizza to be random cosmic noise. Their technology was, to put it charitably, quaint. They had just figured out how to exceed light speed without turning themselves into interesting new forms of matter. Their ships looked like they'd been designed by someone who had been told what space was, but had never actually seen it. All bulky angles and exposed parts that made aerodynamics experts across 17 systems simultaneously develop eye twitches. "They use chemical propulsion for planetary landings," whispered Ambassador Cax of the Vexar to his aide, in the tone one might use to discuss a child eating sand. "Actual combustion, like savages with particularly ambitious fireworks." What humans lacked in technological advancement, they made up for with an almost pathological optimism that the galaxy found both amusing and vaguely concerning. When informed that their solar system was technically in a sector claimed by the Drazik swarm, the human ambassador had smiled politely and asked if the swarm would like to discuss timeshare options. The Drazik, who had consumed 3 civilizations that week alone, were so confused by the response that they agreed to negotiations purely out of scientific curiosity. The physical attributes of humans did little to impress the galactic community. They lacked the natural weapons that most species evolved before achieving sentience. No venom glands, no razor appendages, not even proper fangs. Their sensory capabilities were laughably limited. They couldn't see most of the electromagnetic spectrum, their hearing range was pretty narrow, and their olfactory senses were so poor that several scent-based species had to be diplomatically restrained from offering medical assistance during first contact. "They're basically walking nutrient sacks," observed General Hakar of the Trillion Defense Force. "It's a miracle they weren't consumed by their first alien encounter." What puzzled the galactic community most was how these soft, sensory-deprived creatures had managed to survive on their homeworld, which preliminary surveys revealed to be a death trap of natural disasters, atmospheric extremes, and aggressive fauna. Earth made most military training planets look like luxury resorts. The answer, according to the humans themselves, was something they called ingenuity, which, as far as anyone could tell, meant the stubborn refusal to accept limitations that should have killed them millennia ago. When asked how they had overcome their planet's predators without natural defenses, the human representative had shrugged and said, "We just kept throwing rocks until we figured out better ways to throw rocks." The Galactic Armaments Committee had laughed politely while quietly adding a footnote to humanity's species profile. Despite their underwhelming entrance, humans were granted provisional membership in the Galactic Concord, that grand forum where the destinies of stars were decided between elaborate refreshment breaks. The decision wasn't so much a recognition of human potential as it was a collective shrug. What harm could they possibly do? The humans, for their part, logically seemed pathetically grateful for the opportunity. They established embassies, trade outposts, and cultural exchanges with an enthusiasm that would have been endearing if it wasn't so exhausting. They wanted to learn everything, meet everyone, and taste everything that wouldn't immediately poison them. And according to the Galactic Medical Registry's rapidly expanding human incidence file, several things that would. "They're like galaxy tourists," said Trade Minister Quap of the Merchant Confederacy. "They'll burn out their curiosity engines in a decade and settle into their place at the bottom of the hierarchy." Humanity's diplomatic corps quickly gained a reputation for being eerily agreeable. When faced with demands that would have outraged other species, human negotiators would simply nod, make a notation in their primitive data devices, and ask clarifying questions in a tone so reasonable it bordered on suspicious. "I told them the tariff on their exports would be 80%, confessed Sub-Administrator Glix of the Commerce Authority. "They thanked me for the information, and as for the paperwork, no objections, no threats, no dramatic gestures. It's unnatural." What no one quite registered was how those same tariffs mysteriously decreased over the following months, or how the humans never actually paid the original rate, or how Sub-Administrator Glix suddenly became an outspoken advocate for Earth-made luxury goods. The humans established their main embassy on Concordia Prime, the galaxy's diplomatic hub. It was a modest structure compared to the towering monuments other species had erected as testaments to their importance. The human embassy looked almost intentionally unimposing, a low-slung building with lots of windows and something they called a garden that various diplomatic staff members from chlorophyll-based species found themselves inexplicably drawn to. Inside this unremarkable building, humans served beverages containing mild psychoactive compounds they called coffee and small discs of cooked carbohydrates they called cookies. To anyone who visited, several high-ranking officials from across the galaxy developed habits of dropping by the human embassy before important votes or negotiations, ostensibly to monitor the newcomers, but actually to indulge in these simple refreshments that somehow made galactic politics slightly more bearable. By the end of their first standard galactic year as members of the Concord, humans had achieved precisely nothing of note. They had no significant technological contributions, no military victories, no groundbreaking scientific discoveries. They remained, by all observable metrics, at the bottom of the galactic hierarchy. And yet somehow they were invited to twice as many diplomatic functions as protocol required. Their trade agreements, while minor, were consistently favorable. Their cultural exchanges were oversubscribed. Their requests for information access were granted with minimal scrutiny. Their harmlessness was the consensus among the galactic powers, entertaining, occasionally useful as neutral third parties, but ultimately inconsequential. The ancient collectives, those vast hive minds that had witnessed the rise and fall of countless civilizations, noted a curious statistical anomaly regarding human interactions, a subtle pattern of escalating influence that defied probability. They began to formulate a theorem to explain this phenomenon. They never finished it. No one was quite sure why the collective suddenly redirected their considerable mental resources toward an intensive study of human entertainment media instead, something about a show called reality television that they found mathematically impossible yet existentially captivating. As the humans settled into galactic society, adapting with remarkable speed to its complexities, a few keen observers might have noticed something odd. For a species so recently introduced to interstellar politics, they seemed to avoid making enemies with suspicious skill. Those who did express anti-human sentiments often found their credibility mysteriously undermined, their allies inexplicably distant, their resources strangely diminished. But such patterns were subtle, easily dismissed as coincidence or paranoia. After all, what threat could these primitive newcomers possibly pose to civilizations that had mastered the fundamental forces of the universe? The galaxy continued turning. The great powers continued their eternal dance of alliance and rivalry, and humanity continued smiling, watching, learning, and waiting. No one noticed the predator in their midst. Why would they? It didn't have claws or fangs. It just had patience and a plan. Approximately 27 galactic standard years into humanity's cosmic debut, certain patterns began emerging that even the most dismissive alien intelligence couldn't entirely ignore, not that they didn't try their absolute hardest to do exactly that. The first curious incident involved the Krak Dominion, a particularly nasty bunch whose idea of diplomatic relations involved ritualistic threats, and whose economic policy could be summarized as, "Whatever isn't nailed down is technically ours." They had, in their infinite wisdom, decided that human colony ships were ideal targets for taxation through intimidation, a practice that had served them well with other emerging species. After the third human transport was boarded, the Krak simply stopped. No announcements, no diplomatic cables, no acknowledgement of any change in policy. They just redirected their predatory attentions elsewhere with such abruptness that several other minor species got metaphorical whiplash from the sudden shift. Unusual, noted diplomatic analyst P. Ver of the Galactic Archives. The Krak abandoning a vulnerable target without extracting maximum value defies their established behavioral patterns by approximately 98.7%. When pressed for an explanation, the Krak representatives would mutter something about resource allocation efficiency and strategic pivoting, terms they had clearly memorized rather than understood. Their eyes, all 7 of them, would dart nervously around the room as if searching for eavesdroppers, despite being in sealed diplomatic chambers specifically designed to prevent such intrusions. Coincidentally, this sudden change in Krak policy occurred shortly after a delegation of human cultural anthropologists requested a tour of the Dominion's ancestral homeworld to better understand their glorious heritage. What exactly transpired during that tour remains undocumented in any official capacity, though rumors persisted about the humans displaying an uncomfortable familiarity with certain neurological pressure points that the Krak had evolved to keep secret from potential predators. Similar anomalies began cropping up across the galactic stage with increasing frequency. The Quarth hegemony, notorious for their cutthroat trade practices and contractual traps, suddenly became remarkably generous in their dealings with human merchants. Their famous micron print clauses, those contractual gotchas written in font sizes requiring molecular-level vision, disappeared entirely from human agreements. They're learning fair trade practices, declared Trade Commissioner Hav optimistically at a Galactic Commerce Committee meeting. "They're terrified," whispered his aide, who had witnessed a human negotiator casually mention the names of all 7 of Quarth's executive spawn, their educational institutions, and their daily commute routes, information that was supposedly secured behind security protocols that would make most military installations seem like public parks. Perhaps most telling were the peculiar economic trends that began emerging in sectors with significant human presence. Human businesses, initially dismissed as quaint operations relying on outdated methodologies, began displaying profit margins that defied traditional economic modeling. They weren't just succeeding, they were outperforming established alien corporations that had been operating for centuries. It's their novel approach to consumer psychology, explained economic theorist Zex Talon of the Commerce Guild, using air quotes so vigorous they nearly dislocated two of his tentacle clusters. They've somehow identified design patterns that our predictive algorithms missed. What the esteemed theorist failed to mention was that those same human businesses had an uncanny knack for anticipating market shifts weeks before they occurred, launching products precisely when demand peaked and withdrawing from sectors moments before catastrophic downturns. It wasn't just good business sense. It was as if they had access to future market data or were somehow creating the conditions they needed. The galactic scientific community found itself increasingly puzzled by the rate at which human researchers assimilated and built upon alien technologies. For a species that had been fumbling with basic warp mechanics less than a century ago, they demonstrated an adaptation curve that bordered on statistical impossibility. Their learning methodology must be extraordinarily efficient, proposed Chief Scientist Ulex of the Zenari Science Academy, conveniently ignoring reports that restricted research databases across 17 systems had experienced unexplained access events originating from IP locations suspiciously close to human facilities. What truly began raising quiet alarms among the more perceptive members of galactic society was the strange phenomenon of formerly aggressive species becoming surprisingly accommodating to human diplomatic requests. The infamous Drek Collective, whose foreign policy could charitably be described as activate weapons first, consider communication if there are survivors, suddenly developed an interest in human cinema and approved every trade agreement put before them. They've discovered art appreciation, claimed cultural liaison VPAL, who had never before used the words Drek and appreciation in the same sentence without several negations between them. The curious case of the Drax Imperium proved particularly illustrative. The Drax, historical rivals of humanity's earliest allies in the galactic concord, had been vocal about their disdain for primitive bipeds with delusions of relevance. Their planetary emperor, a being so xenophobic that he used different breathing apparatus for air that might have been processed by foreign lungs, suddenly hosted a human diplomatic dinner at his personal palace. 2 weeks later, the Drax signed an unprecedented resource-sharing agreement with 3 human colony worlds. When questioned about this dramatic policy reversal, the Emperor's eyes would develop a 1,000-yard stare as he mumbled something about the greater cosmic harmony and revelations during meditation. The fact that his meditation chamber had been renovated by a human architectural firm specializing in acoustic optimization went largely unremarked upon in official records. Throughout human diplomatic outposts, a peculiar practice began to emerge: the Cultural Change Program. Ostensibly designed to foster mutual understanding, these programs involved hosting alien dignitaries, military leaders, and corporate executives for extended stays on Earth or human colony worlds. Those who participated invariably returned as enthusiastic advocates for increased cooperation with humanity. The experience was enlightening. A Vexa Supreme strategist told the Military Coordination Council, his typically aggressive demeanor noticeably subdued. "I have come to appreciate human perspectives on various matters." What he didn't mention was how his hosts had shown him historical records of Earth's military conflicts, thousands of years of increasingly sophisticated warfare fought by a species against itself, perfecting the art of violence through relentless practice. He didn't explain how they had casually demonstrated obsolete weapons capable of destruction on scales that even the Vexar found disturbing. He certainly didn't reference the night when his human guide had explained, with unsettling specificity, exactly how Earth forces would theoretically neutralize Vexar battle tactics if hostilities ever erupted. "Just academic discussion," his host had assured him with a smile that somehow displayed too many teeth, despite human dentition being objectively modest compared to most predatory species. Even the Galactic Intelligence Network, that shadowy collective of information gatherers and analysts from major powers, began noticing statistical anomalies in data related to human activities. Information leaks that benefited human interests occurred 73% more frequently than probability models predicted. Encryption systems thought impenetrable would inexplicably fail when containing data crucial to human negotiations. "Coincidence and confirmation bias," declared Intelligence Director KX dismissively during a classified briefing. 2 days later, he took an unexpected retirement and relocated to a human resort colony, citing health concerns and a newfound interest in Earth's liquid refreshment called cocktails. His replacement immediately closed all investigations into human intelligence activities. Perhaps most disturbing were the whispered reports of species who had directly opposed human interests simply disappearing. Not entire civilizations, that would have been too obvious, but key individuals, research facilities, or in one notable case, an entire moon that had housed a weapons development laboratory. The official explanations ranged from tragic accidents to miscalibrated navigational coordinates to spontaneous quantum tunneling events, each more implausible than the last. For species with longer lifespans and institutional memories measured in millennia rather than decades, these patterns were beginning to form the archivists of the eternal record, those meticulous chroniclers of galactic history, created a sealed file titled Anomalous Influence Vectors, Species 42 Gamma 7, the classification code assigned to humans. The file grew at an exponential rate, yet discussion of these concerns remained fragmentary and isolated. Those who raised questions too persistently about human activities often found themselves reassigned to distant posts, discredited by suddenly discovered personal scandals, or in several notable cases, developing an abrupt passion for extreme sports on high-gravity worlds with poor safety records. At diplomatic functions, representatives from elder species would occasionally exchange meaningful glances when human delegates proposed initiatives that seemed suspiciously beneficial to Earth's long-term interests while appearing superficially advantageous to all parties. Yet none dared voice their misgivings openly. Statistical patterns suggested increasing human influence disproportionate to their technological development level, observed a senior member of the ancient collectives in an encrypted communication to their leadership cluster. The response came back with unusual swiftness. Analysis suspended by executive override. Redirect computational resources to Human Entertainment Archive Categorization Priority Alpha. As the decades passed, these scattered observations remained just that, disconnected data points without a unifying theory. The galaxy, in its complacent wisdom, continued to view humans as amusing upstarts with good luck and unusual charm. After all, what could one young species possibly achieve against civilizations that had been manipulating cosmic forces since before humans had figured out agriculture? The answer, as it turned out, was quite a lot. Someone just needed to connect the dots. Ambassador Tell of the Zenari Dominion was not by nature a paranoid being. 6,000 years of diplomatic service had instilled in him a certain unfappable composure that his younger colleagues often mistook for apathy. But something about the humans had always triggered what his species called the crystalline dis, that subtle internal vibration that warned of patterns too dangerous to ignore. It began with a data compilation project that should have been routine. As the Zenari representative to the Galactic Historical Commission, Tel Krell was tasked with analyzing interspecies conflict resolution over the past century, a standard report, the kind that usually gathered digital dust in the vast archives of the Concordia Prime Library. Computer, display all instances of territorial disputes involving human colonies, he commanded one evening, expecting perhaps a dozen minor incidents. The holographic display filled his chamber from floor to ceiling with hundreds of data points, each representing a conflict that had somehow resolved in humanity's favor, without a single official military engagement. "That can't be right," he muttered, his crystalline form resonating with confusion. "Filter for data corruption." The computer chimed placidly. "No corruption detected. Data integrity at 99.97%. For the next 17 rotations, Krell abandoned his other duties and dove into the anomaly. He tracked diplomatic communications, trade agreements, cultural exchange programs, and military posturing across 100 star systems. He compiled dossiers on alien representatives who had shifted positions after contact with human diplomats. He analyzed economic trends in sectors before and after human commercial entities established presence. The pattern that emerged was as undeniable as it was disturbing. "They're playing a different game entirely," he whispered to his private journal. "While we move pieces across the board, they've been slowly replacing the board itself." With growing unease, Krell expanded his investigation to humanity's biological and evolutionary history, accessing Earth's scientific databases with his high-level clearance. What he found sent reverberations through his crystalline matrix so violent that he had to engage emergency stabilization protocols. Humans had evolved on a death world. This was common knowledge, but what wasn't widely understood were the implications. Earth wasn't just dangerous. It was an evolutionary pressure cooker that had forged humans through millions of years of relentless natural selection. Unlike most intelligent species, who evolved either as specialized apex predators or as prey species that developed intelligence as a survival mechanism, humans occupied a bizarre middle ground. They were persistence predators who had once chased prey until it collapsed from exhaustion. Not the fastest, not the strongest, but arguably the most terrifyingly stubborn hunters their planet had produced. "They sweat," Krell noted with horror. "They evolved a cooling system that allows them to regulate body temperature during extended physical activity. They can literally chase prey until it dies of heat exhaustion." This evolutionary quirk had profound implications. Humans hadn't just developed intelligence, they had developed a predatory patience, unlike anything the galaxy had seen before. Where other species might launch immediate attacks when threatened, humans had evolved to play the long game. Their recorded history is essentially an unbroken chain of warfare, he documented, reviewing Earth's historical archives. Not occasional territorial disputes like most evolved species, but constant adaptive conflict. They had been fighting each other for dominance since before they developed written language. The implications were staggering. While most spacefaring civilizations had to learn the art of war after achieving technology advanced enough for interstellar travel, humans had been perfecting it for thousands of years before they ever left their atmosphere. War wasn't a diplomatic failure to them, it was cultural heritage. Even more disturbing was their psychological profile. Humans displayed a capacity for both extreme violence and profound empathy, often within the same individual. They could conceptualize the suffering of others in vivid detail, a trait that, in most species, led to pacifism. Yet somehow, They used that same understanding to inflict more precise suffering when necessary. They weaponized empathy, Krell recorded, his tone becoming increasingly agitated. They understand others not just to connect with them, but to better predict and manipulate their behavior. The historical record showed that human military strategy had evolved from direct confrontation to something far more insidious. They had mastered psychological warfare, economic pressure, cultural infiltration, and political manipulation, often achieving their objectives without firing a single shot. Computer, display visual representation of human diplomatic influence expansion over the past 50 years, Krell commanded. The resulting hologram resembled a virus spreading through a host body. Tendrils of influence extended outward from Earth, wrapping around key systems, infiltrating power centers, and establishing redundancies that would be nearly impossible to excise. It wasn't just their evolutionary history that made humans dangerous. It was their unique social structure. Unlike hive minds that sacrificed individuality for collective strength, or hierarchical species that maintained rigid order, humans balanced individual innovation with collective action in a way that maximized adaptability. They function like a distributed intelligence network, Krell noted. Individual units can operate independently when isolated, yet rapidly integrate into collective action when necessary. It's the worst of both worlds. Unpredictable individuals who can still function as coordinated groups. Their technological development pattern was equally disturbing. Most species followed predictable paths of advancement, building logically on previous discoveries. Humans, by contrast, made intuitive leaps that defied conventional progression. They might lag centuries behind in one field while making breakthrough advancements in another, often combining disparate technologies in ways that more logical species would never consider. They don't respect technological boundaries, Krell's analysis continued. Where we see distinct scientific disciplines, they see tools to be combined and repurposed. Their so-called primitive technology is often just deliberately simplified for ease of maintenance and adaptation. The most damning evidence came from what Krell called the diplomatic shadow, the hidden patterns of influence that followed official human engagement. Species that entered agreements with humans invariably found themselves drawn deeper into Earth's sphere of influence. Resource-rich worlds suddenly discovered human scientific outposts in their systems. Military powers found their strategic advantages slowly neutralized through seemingly benign trade arrangements. They don't conquer, Krell realized with growing horror. They subvert. They transform potential enemies into assets without them ever realizing they've been compromised. By the time Krell had compiled his full report, he understood what humanity truly was, not simply another intelligence, but a patient predator that had evolved to hunt other apex species. They were meta-predators, creatures that specialized in understanding, infiltrating, and ultimately dominating the dominant species around them. Earth's evolutionary history had produced beings uniquely suited to identify weaknesses in social structures, exploit psychological vulnerabilities, and patiently manipulate complex systems to their advantage. Humans didn't need superior technology or overwhelming force. They simply needed time and access, and the galaxy had given them both. With trembling crystalline appendages, Krell prepared his findings for presentation to the Galactic Security Council. The evidence was irrefutable. The threat was existential. Humanity wasn't just another emerging power. It was a virus spreading through the galactic body politic, rewiring systems to serve its purposes while maintaining the illusion of normalcy. As he encoded his report with the highest security protocols, Tell permitted himself a moment of grim satisfaction. He had identified the threat. There was still time to contain it. The great powers of the galaxy, once alerted, could surely coordinate to quarantine human influence before it reached critical mass. The next morning, Krell received a message that the Security Council meeting had been rescheduled, then postponed indefinitely. His access credentials were mysteriously revoked due to system maintenance. When he attempted to contact Allied diplomats directly, мизрение, он обнаружил, что его права на общение приостановлены до рассмотрения нарушений протокола, нарушений, которые conveniently имели неконкретную документацию. Within a week, rumors began circulating about Krell's mental stability. Old reports from early in his career were dredged up, highlighting instances of pattern recognition overreach and conspiracy theorizing, accusations that had never been mentioned in his 6,000 years of service. His closest allies began to distance themselves. The Zanari High Command recommended he take an extended leave of absence for crystal realignment therapy. His research assistant disappeared, along with all local copies of his findings. As he sat in his increasingly isolated chamber, watching his career and credibility disintegrate around him, Krell received an unexpected visitor, a human diplomatic attaché he had met perhaps twice at formal functions. "Ambassador Krell," the human said with a warm smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "I heard you've been under stress lately. Our cultural attaché thought you might enjoy some Earth literature to help you relax." The human placed a small data crystal on Krell's desk. On it was a single book title, How to Win Friends and Influence People. "It's a classic from our history," the human explained, "all about building positive relationships." As the human turned to leave, he paused at the doorway. "Oh, and Ambassador, we're really looking forward to that cultural exchange program next month. Your planet's crystal forests sound absolutely fascinating. Our geological survey team can't wait to visit." The door hissed shut, leaving Krell alone with the growing realization that his discovery had come far too late. The cancer had already metastasized. The predator had already infiltrated the host, and no one was going to believe his warning because the apex predator had already established itself at the top of the food chain, not through force, but through the slow, careful manipulation of the entire ecosystem. In his private journal, encrypted with algorithms even the Zanari High Command couldn't crack, Krell wrote his final analysis. They didn't invade. They didn't conquer. They did something far worse. They made themselves essential, and we invited them in. 3 days later, Ambassador Toker announced his retirement from diplomatic service and his surprising decision to accept a teaching position at the newly established Interspecies Cultural Understanding Institute on Earth. The Galactic Security Council convened under the crystalline dome of Concordia Prime to review a report on humanity's rapid integration into galactic affairs. Grand Counselor Rexal of the Vexar Imperium immediately sensed something amiss. Ambassador Krell, who had authored the security proposal, was conspicuously absent. A human representative approached the central data node with what her species called a diplomatic smile. Nothing overtly threatening about her, yet Rexal's dorsal spines flattened instinctively. "As the Council considers security implications," she said, "we believe it's important to highlight the stabilizing effects of interspecies cooperation." The display filled with impressive visualizations, conflict zones disappearing, trade routes multiplying, former aggressive species now remarkably docile following human diplomatic engagement. "This is precisely the concerning pattern in the Zanari report," Rexal interjected. "The statistical improbability suggests that cooperation yields better results than conflict." "Interruption!" Councillor Jarvi, formerly known for his hawkish positions, snapped. Rexal noticed a human-style bracelet on the councillor's communication limb. The human representative smoothly redirected Jarvi's concerns into support for her real purpose, an interspecies security cooperation initiative with humans in key advisory roles across all galactic defense systems. Given the threats you've identified, wouldn't enhanced coordination be prudent? She asked, with helpful concern. Rexall watched in horror as heads nodded around the chamber. Even the ancient collectives pulsed with approval. Patterns, Rexall attempted. I request time to review Ambassador Krell's complete findings. The Zenari junior diplomat responded, Ambassador Krell has taken an extended sabbatical for health reasons. We've discovered portions of his research failed to meet our methodological standards. The human representative caught Rexall's eye for a microsecond, conveying a single message. We know you know. The council voted almost unanimously. Rexall's lone dissent registered as a technical malfunction. Afterward, the human approached him. We'd be honored to host you at our retreat facility, she said. The hunting preserves are designed specifically with Vexar physiology in mind. When Rexall declined, she responded pleasantly. Family is important to us as well. Your spawn are at the Central Education Complex on your homeworld, correct? The eldest just started advanced predatory tactics training, I believe. Rexall heard himself saying, Perhaps I could rearrange my schedule. He realized with perfect clarity what humanity truly was, evolutionary specialists in subversion and control, patient predators who had perfected the art of hunting without appearing to hunt. They had become apex predators not through superior strength or technology, but by making themselves indispensable while systematically neutralizing any entity that recognized the threat they posed. That same day, the Galactic News Network announced the unanimous approval of the initiative and the appointment of the first human High Coordinator to the Galactic Security Council, a position created specifically to facilitate cross-species communication. On Earth, in an office deep within a nondescript government building, humans watched the announcement without celebration. They simply nodded in quiet satisfaction and updated a strategic timeline that had been in motion since their first steps into the galactic community. Phase 1 was complete, and the galaxy never even noticed it had been hunted.